Today on the official Marvel podcast, we discuss and answer your questions about episode 4 of Marvel Television's Agatha All Along with stars Ali Ahn, Patti LuPone, Aubrey Plaza, and more.
It was pretty special. I mean, how many times do you get to have an original song and actually get to perform it?
Plus, we chat with historian and novelist Katherine Howe about the history of the Salem Panic.
I think the biggest, most common misconception is that they were burned at the stake. We didn't actually do that in North America.
That's not all. We have also got Marvel's Spider-Man 2 composer John Paesano on the show to explain how his Marvel fandom helped him create the game's score.
You have all these guys that have done incredible scores, and you have to kind of try to find your place in that world.
And we've also got a breakdown on VENOM, aka Eddie Brock, that you won't want to miss.
I'm Langston Belton.
And I'm Sade Spence.
And this is the official Marvel podcast.
Now, last week's episode of Agatha All Along featured a continuation of our coven's adventures down the witch's road. Though this time it's Ali Ahn's character, Alice Wu Gulliver, that is faced with the next trial.
That's right. But before we delve too deep into the episode, we got to run our spoiler warning because we are going to be spoiling episode 4 of Agatha All Along. So if you haven't watched the episode yet or you're behind, don't worry. Just skip to the next segment until you're all caught up. Cool? Very cool. The coolest. All right. Run that spoiler warning. All right, warning achieved. Now, this episode featured a cool 70s themed trial for the coven that involved some surprising new layers for the Ballad of the Witch's Road and a lot of family history revealed for the coven's protector witch, Alice Wu Gulliver, played by Ali Ahn.
She's got a lot of armor because she's actually so mushy on the inside. And I think that's really interesting to see if you can sort of fight your inherited, defense mechanisms. And I think everyone can relate to mommy issues, right? Everyone's got a little mommy issues.
Throughout this episode, we learned that Alice's mom, Lorna Wu, was also in search of the Witch's Road. Alice reveals that her mother's fans were her coven and that she'd sing her own version of the Ballad of the Witch's Road during her concerts in attempts to open the door to the road. So creative.
Very, the most creative. And it is that clue that helps our witches once the trial begins as they realize that Alice's mom used the Ballad of the Witch's Road as a protection spell on Alice. The idea that someone somewhere is always singing the ballad and therefore protecting Alice.
I think it was really fun to just get to see her crack open, and it's a fun arc to go on. I feel really lucky.
To reverse the spell, Agatha realizes that the coven needs to play Lorna's version of the ballad, so they each take an instrument and begin to jam out.
All right, now check this out. Here's the lineup. It's a killer lineup. We've got Rio on drums, Agatha on vocals, Alice on piano, and then Teen on guitar.
In order to prepare for this particular scene, Ali trained with a vocal coach and practiced pretty regularly.
I would come home from shooting long days and knowing that episode was coming up and be like, I gotta practice. Yeah. I mean, I was practicing my little hiney off in this rented keyboard so that I could make, because I wasn't sure if I was playing the song live. I didn't know what it was gonna be. But it's cool. We got to be in a band together. It was so fun. It was so, and that song is amazing. I mean, it felt like such an honor to get to play a jam like that. It was pretty special. I mean, how many times do you get to have an original song and actually get to perform it?
And Ali isn't the only one who gushed about this scene.
I'm a closet rocker, or I'm a closet rocker groupie. I can't decide which one.
That's Patti LuPone, who plays Lilia Calderwood, and we spoke to her and her co-star Aubrey Plaza together about this musical moment in the series.
So it was kind of cool to be dressed like Liza Minnelli or Cheetah Rivera, take your pick, and play a tambourine like Stevie Nicks next to Aubrey playing the drums.
Oh, yeah. I was playing those drums.
It was great. We were in a rock band.
Oh, I love that you can hear the sheer joy this scene brought Patti, who is, of course, an absolute legend. And she really did have the time of her life on set that day, it sounds like.
Which is incredible to hear, considering she's Broadway legend and is still a groupie, a fan of doing something like this. So it's just incredible. And it does make sense because it's not just music, it's performance. There's the hair, the makeup, the costumes that really complete the scene. Who doesn't want to get dressed up in those costumes and just rock out?
And I love my outfit. That was the one thing. The costumes were insane. I loved all my reference photos. Cher was a big reference for that look. The hair and makeup team killed it. It was fun.
Yeah.
Yes, the costumes and makeup were definitely clutch in bringing this scene to life, though Sashir Zamata, who plays Jennifer Kale, claims that the production design was what sold it for her.
The actual like space, there were so many things where I was like, oh, I want to take that couch. Ooh, I want to take that lamp. Like it was just like the set dressing was so beautiful, and it's fun to be in a project like that.
Agatha All Along is streaming only on Disney+. Be sure to check out the latest episode and check back in with us next week as we uncover some behind-the-scenes moments and answer your biggest questions. As we wait for the next episode of Agatha All Along, I gotta admit, I've fallen down a bit of a massive rabbit hole, or witch's road, if you will, on the history of witches, witchcraft, and even the Salem Witch Trials, Langston.
Ooh, any interesting and/or horrifying findings from your research?
Oh, absolutely horrifying things, Langston. Just horrifying. But I thought I'd invite New York Times bestselling and award-winning historian and author Katherine Howe onto the show to share. So outside of writing about the Salem Witch Trials, get this. She's also the descendant of not one, but 2 women who were actually accused of being a witch. Wild. Let's take a listen. So I am thrilled to be speaking with Katherine Howe. You are a witchcraft expert, a Salem historian. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me, Sade. I'm so excited to be joining you.
Let's dive right in. What got you interested in studying witchcraft in the first place?
First of all, I mean, who isn't interested in witchcraft? I feel like witchcraft is kind of like objectively just one of those fascinations that we all kind of share. My interest in it really started when I was a graduate student in American and New England studies, and I moved to this little tiny town just next door to Salem, Massachusetts. And so it was striking to me as someone who thought about American history to think about how we go from this shocking moment where 19 people were put to death by the state for a crime that less than a generation later ceased to exist. For the people who were caught up in the Salem witch trials, the women who were accused as witches, the mostly adolescent girls who were doing the accusing, the theologians who were in charge, the magistrates who were in charge, they all lived in a mental landscape and a religious landscape that believed magic and witchcraft were real. And I felt like most of the fictional versions of Salem that we encounter are either these very skeptical accounts, like The Crucible, which treat people in the past with some condescension, like how could anyone possibly believed in such nonsense? Or it's kind of a cute fantasy kind of picture, which is great, which is also fun, but I felt like there wasn't a fictional version of Salem that took the colonial perspective in witchcraft and magic seriously as reality.
There is this term called the Salem Panic. What was encompassed in it? Is it just being accused of being a witch, or is there more to this?
So in the 17th century, in the 1600s, there were actually a number of people who were accused in the North American colonies as witches, but it didn't turn into like a big widespread social panic. It didn't spread to so many people the way that it did in Salem. Salem was really unusual for how widespread it was. It started out in Salem Village, and what happened was a couple of girls, one was the daughter, Betty Paris, of the minister in Salem Village, and the other was Abigail Williams, who was found out to service in Samuel Paris's household. This was an 11-year-old girl whose birth family could not care for her, and so essentially gave her away to another family to be, a servant and to be obedient. So Betty and Abigail fell into fits. What's interesting to me about that is that their term for fits actually encompassed what to us looks just like silly child behavior. So like, for example, there's an example of Abigail Williams in her fits, in quotation marks, ironic quotation marks, running around in the parsonage kitchen, flapping her arms, saying she's going to fly up the chimney and going, wish, 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 like running around and playing and shouting and being rambunctious.
Sounds like an 11-year-old.
It's right. It sounds like an 11-year-old who's being a pain. And so there's another example of Abigail Williams in her fits, where in church one day, there's a visiting minister, And so Abigail stands up and says to this visiting minister, this guy is very powerful and prominent. She stands up in front of everybody and says, name your text. And what she means is, what passage of the Bible is he going to be speaking about? And he says what passage it is. And she rolls her eyes and goes, oh, it's a long text. And that kind of cheek, that misbehavior, was such a challenge to the Puritan power structure at that time that the only way they could explain it was by saying that Abigail was under the influence of the devil.
It sounds like she just spoke her mind. And then it was, accused of witchcraft. And I kind of wanted to circle back because you mentioned earlier young adolescent girls, women accused of witchcraft. Was it predominantly just women and adolescent girls? And secondly, did they have any characteristics that they shared?
So the very first people who were accused were kind of what you might call the usual suspects. They were women in Salem Village who did not have a lot of social power. So the very first person who was accused was a woman named Tituba, or sometimes it's spelled Titibe, Indian, who was an enslaved person, probably of Carib origin. So Tituba was an enslaved worker in the Paris household, and Betty and Abigail accused her first. First, she denies it. And then there are two records of Tituba's confession. She has one confession one day and then one confession the next day. And in between, there's some historians who've posited that there are signs that she was beaten in between. And the second confession that she gives is the one that introduces the idea of there being a conspiracy of witches, that she bewitched the girls, she didn't want to, some witches in town made her do it, and she doesn't know how many there are. And that idea sort of introduces the idea of like, we don't know who among us who are our neighbors who we trust is actually secretly a witch who's doing these things. So the other two women who were accused at the beginning were Sarah Good, who was a beggar and destitute, and Sarah Osborne, who was kind of a sort of idiosyncratic. She hadn't been going to church. She'd taken up with a younger lover. These are three women who have very little social power and who also in some way buck the expectations of their society. So I want to emphasize, they're not doing anything. They're not meeting in covens in the wilderness. That didn't happen. That was not a thing that happened. People who were accused as witches during the Salem Panic and during early modern witch hunting in general were accused because they were the wrong kind of person.
You mentioned the meeting in the forest as covens, not a real thing. Where did it come from?
There were some hints of in the testimony of afflicted girls saying that they had seen gatherings of witches and they didn't know who they were and they didn't know how many there were. So no one admitted to showing up at a gathering, but afflicted girls said that they had seen witches gathering together, or that they had seen witches send their spirits out in the night and that those spirits had gathered together. So that is where that idea came from.
Are there any other common misconceptions about witches, witchcraft, or the trials?
I think the biggest, most common misconception is that they were burned at the stake. We didn't actually do that in North America. Witches were burned at the stake in ecclesiastical trials on mainland Europe in the 1400s. But witchcraft in colonial North America was a felony offense, just like murder, and it was punished as a felony, which is to say it was punished by hanging.
So in the Marvel universe, we have Agatha Harkness, super powerful witch who dates back to 17th century Salem. And in Marvel Studios' WandaVision, we see Agatha turn against her coven to try and gain more power. So in real world history, were there ever cases of accused, alleged witches turning on each other for survival?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, Tituba, Indian, and I don't blame her for this one bit, who pointed the finger at Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. And this was unusual for the time, but very quickly it was revealed that if you were accused as a witch and you confessed and then named somebody else, it was actually a way, in this one instance, of being spared the gallows, which was highly unusual because in other examples of early modern witch trials, if you confessed, you were toast. You were going to be hanged within the week.
So what do we know of descendants of the witches of that time in Salem?
Well, here's a funny thing. So when I was a teenager, I learned that I was partly related to a couple of Salem witches, one whose name was Elizabeth Howe. Not super surprising that we are actually related because that's my name. My last name is
How did we
Howe.
not start with this?
I know,
You talked about humanizing the trials. I'm like, I'm looking at a descendant.
Yes. I've met someone who's a Hawthorne descendant from Judge Hawthorne, who was one of the judges at the Salem Witch Trials. In fact, I've had a person who was a descendant of one of the judges came up to me in tears and apologized because Elizabeth Howe had been put to death. And I was like, dude, it's okay.
It's been a few years.
It's okay.
This
is not something that you need to feel personally responsible for.
Thank you so much, Katherine Howe, for being here, speaking with us, and literally blowing our minds.
Thank you.
Oh, wow. That's so cool. Sade, I feel like I might have to join you and go down a witchy rabbit hole or witch road or whatever witches travel down after that conversation.
I think it's time, Langston. Join my coven.
Oh, good. Sign me up. I'll pay the dues. I'm in. And since we are on the topic now of obsessions that have sort of taken over our lives, it's been nearly a year since the release of Marvel's Spider-Man 2 for the PlayStation 5. And even though, I've played through the game multiple times, I think I'm on my 9th playthrough right now, what I actually find myself doing more is pressing play on Marvel's Spider-Man 2 original video game soundtrack during commutes, workouts, and even while I'm just walking around the house looking at my cat, which is a lot of fun. That's why I am extremely excited to introduce our next guest, John Paesano. John Paesano has worked on scores for TV shows like Marvel's Daredevil, movies like Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, and he's also worked on the Marvel's Spider-Man video game franchise since its debut in 2018. It seems so long ago. And I got a chance to pick his brain on the follow-up score for Marvel's Spider-Man 2. All right, everyone. I am beyond excited to talk to this fine creative force, the composer behind Marvel's Spider-Man series from Insomniac Games, the one, the only, John Paesano. John, how are you today?
Good, man. Thanks for having me.
I mean, I want to talk to you about so much. What led you to work on Marvel's Spider-Man? This wasn't your first Marvel project, right?
I mean, the first Marvel project that I had ever worked on was Daredevil. And I got on that gig because I was just a huge fan of it.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm glad you brought up your work on Marvel's Daredevil. How does the process differ between scoring something like Daredevil and something like Marvel Spider-Man, which is an interactive experience? How does that process differ between the two?
The cool thing with video game music that I find extremely fascinating, kind of being a student of the game, so to speak, of just putting music to media, it really is closer to how films were scored in the 1960s and 70s versus how film scores typically are scored today. And the reason why I say that is because I'll use just a very broad example, but when John Williams scored Star Wars, it's not like he had a sequencer and he could throw up quick times in a sequencer and put markers in on the timeline and start writing music. They didn't have the technology and they didn't have the film. I mean, they couldn't digitize film and therefore they couldn't get into any type of computer and the computers didn't even exist. So there was this very different way that folks used to write film scores back in the 60s and 70s and 50s and 40s. It was very different. They couldn't rely on just writing music to what fit with picture. They had to rely on story. They had to rely on production art. They had to rely on just conversations that they would have with directors and producers and all the different folks that were involved in the process. And with video game scoring, it's very similar because we don't have the luxury of just the finished game that we can throw up and play and try to figure out what music should go where. We have to kind of adopt this system of talking with the director, looking at production artwork. It's very story driven.
Spider-Man, as you said, is an iconic character who has had iconic themes throughout the ages.
Yeah.
What was that process like, creating a new Spider-Man theme for this iteration of the character? What was that like?
Yeah, it was hard. It was hard
to say the least.
I mean, it's not even. It's also too. It's not even Spider-Man. It's also like Marvel. There's such a language with a lot of the Marvel scores, right? And there's this huge fan base that you want to bring along, and there's always that. There's always your own biases that want to kind of do your own thing on something. But at the end of the day, this character is not. It's not my character. It belongs to the fans, and it belongs to Marvel. And there's a lot of folks that have stake in the game that they have their ideas as well too. So there's this delicate dance that you have to do where you have to, you always have to make a decision on these things. And especially with I've worked on a lot of. I just finished doing Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, which was another kind of similar thing where there's like this huge musical legacy with Planet of the Apes, and there's Giacchino and Goldsmith and Patrick Doyle and all these folks that have done great scores for a franchise. In Spider-Man, you got Elfman, you got Giacchino again, you have, Chris Young, you have Horner, you have Zimmer, you have all these guys that have done incredible scores for the game, and you have to kind of try to find your place in that world, and it's tricky, and part of me feels like it would be so much easier just to do something completely different, because it's like. But at the same time, too, it's always this struggle of trying to figure out what does the audience want? What do the fans want? And so when I do approach these questions and ideas, I always think to myself, like, what would I want if I wanted to see Spider-Man on the screen? What do I love about Spider-Man? What do I love about the Marvel world? And, so it's funny. So I do kind of approach it from a very fan-centric point of view, not really as a composer.
And so now going all the way from creating that theme in that first game all the way to Marvel Spider-Man 2, which of course is a sequel. What themes did you bring from that first game into this, or do things kind of like grow and evolve as the story does?
The cool thing about Spider-Man 2, when we approached it, obviously the big conversation that we had about the score for Spider-Man 2 was everything about Venom. And the symbiote, the way that it physically works, how it kind of takes over things and infects things, that's how I wanted to deal with the symbiotics kind of theme. I wanted it to be not like a melodic theme for the symbiote and Venom. I wanted it to be something that would infect our pre-existing themes. So we're still using a lot of the pre-existing themes from the first game, but when Venom and Symbiote kind of like come into contact with these themes, it's something more that affects the themes. And you'll hear the Spider-Man theme, and you get these like bending sounds. There's a lot of treatment that we do to the themes. We distort the themes, and we treat the themes in a way where they feel you can still hear the theme and the original theme, but it's being infected, and it's just kind of like how it's working on screen. So I thought that was like a really cool way to handle, because you could have just gone and done like a melodic theme, for that aspect of the characters. And then we also obviously had Kraven, which is a new character, which is like a new theme. We had Harry, which had his own theme going on. But the cool thing, all these characters, all these themes, when you listen to the soundtrack, you hear the infection starting to happen when they come into contact with the symbiote. So it was a cool vehicle to use as a kind of a new thematic element that was a little bit more untraditional than we had in our original game.
Do you have one track that, maybe not your favorite, because that's tough. That's a tough word to put on it. Maybe not favorite. Do you have a track that even when you think back on it, you're like, oh man, that got to the point where I could evoke the emotion that I really wanted to get on that one?
Yeah, I could give you two of them. For Spider-Man 2, I loved Kraven's track.
Oh, yes.
The reason why I like it is because it was actually really difficult to those type of tracks for composers you have to have the confidence just to say that's all it needs, And for me, that's difficult. I'm a creature of overwriting, you know what I mean? You have all these tools at your fingertips and all this training. And so it's really hard sometimes to write for what the project needs versus writing for other composers.
Oh, I see.
You know what I mean?
Right, yes.
It's just perfect for the character, right? Like that's all it needs. You know, he doesn't need some big, elaborate, super heavy counterpoint, complex harmonically, you know, overridden piece of music. It just needed that, you know? And so that was it was a little scary at first, just going like, okay, this is what we're gonna do. The other one that I really liked, kind of in the opposite manner, just because I thought it was a beautiful theme, was I really like Harry's theme.
Oh, yeah.
It kind of has a little bit of an old school sensibility to it. It has a little bit of like kind of like a Williams vibe to it. And I like injecting some of that Silver Age of cinema world into the Marvel universe.
Right, I love it. It's a little bit of a monster movie because, you know, the tragedy of what happens to Harry. There's this kind of thing of like, you feel so bad because you know that it's not going to necessarily be okay for this character by the end.
It's right on the edge of being a little over the top, but I do like when you can lose yourself in kind of the emotion of stuff. It was a lot of fun.
The soundtrack was recently remastered for Dolby, which is really, really exciting for all the sound nerds out there, all the sound heads that want the finest, crispest quality to lose themselves in. Can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Yeah, it's a pretty technical process. The sad thing is when we record this stuff, that's the original format that it comes in.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to kind of siphon it all down when we give it out to the public because it's just not a very widely accepted format. Not everybody
Right.
has Dolby Atmos just sitting in their, you know, I don't even have it here at the studio, you know? So essentially what we're doing is we're just giving it back to the audience the way it was originally conceived and mixed. So it's a really cool opportunity for fans that have the capability to be able to get it in that original format. And so to be able to kind of hear not just the music, but the actual space, all of a sudden you get this in like this like super three-dimensional, and it's a pretty incredible experience if you have the ability to have it.
Thank you so much for talking with us. This was fantastic. I got goosebumps listening to you talk about just implementing the music into this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful franchise.
No, thanks. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Listen to Marvel's Spider-Man 2 original video game soundtrack wherever you stream music. Now, you just heard John Paesano mention one of the antagonists in Marvel's Spider-Man 2 as Venom. And while this game's version of the symbiote bonds to Harry Osborn, the comic book version of this anti-hero and one of my favorite comic book characters of all time is a bit different.
But if you're confused about who or what Venom is, don't worry, we've got a quick breakdown that'll run through the character's origin and history for you. The story of Eddie Brock, the man who would eventually transform into Venom, is definitely a tragedy, just let me preface. His mother dies while giving birth to him, and his father blames him for it, leaving baby Eddie to be raised by his older sister Mary.
Yeah, and it's not like he has many friends growing up either. In fact, he steals from other children so he can, quote unquote, find and return the missing items later to gain their friendship.
Honestly, so heartbreaking. Brock is later accepted to Empire State University, where he enters their journalism program. During his time at ESU, he meets the law student Anne Wang. They hit it off, and they begin dating and eventually get married.
Well, after graduating, Eddie scores a job as a journalist at the Daily Globe. And if you think things are working out pretty well for Eddie so far, well, buckle up, because we got a whole lot of lore left for you.
As a talented journalist, Eddie investigates the serial killer known as Sin Eater. And so when a mysterious man calls Eddie and claims to be the serial killer, Brock writes and publishes an exclusive story seemingly exposing the serial killer's identity.
But it turns out the guy isn't actually Sin Eater. In fact, the real Sin Eater is brought to justice by Spider-Man that same day. So great for the people of New York City, but absolutely terrible for Eddie's professional reputation. Turns out the guy who Eddie thought was Sin Eater was actually just some delusional individual who is the real Sin Eater's neighbor.
Yeah, so that's why fact checkers are so important. And I wish I could tell you that this is where things start to look up for our guy, Eddie, but I'm afraid it only gets much, much worse. Eddie gets fired from the Daily Globe, his wife leaves him, and his father pretty much disowns him. So this leaves Eddie completely overwhelmed by shame. And so he decides to take his own life. But before doing so, he pays a visit to Our Lady of Saints Church to beg for forgiveness for the sin he's about to commit.
And it is here that Eddie comes face to gooey face with the alien symbiote creature that transforms him into Venom. Now, what's that, you ask? What is a symbiote, and what is one doing in a church? Well, I'm so glad you asked.
The Venom symbiote is actually part of a symbiotic species of hive-minded aliens from the planet Clintar. They were originally created by a dark elder god named Null in order to dominate and destroy other races, though this particular creature refuses to obey Null's will.
This refusal causes its fellow symbiotes to judge it insane, and it's placed in a prison to be studied before eventually being executed. However, our symbiote is saved when a near-omnipotent being known as the Beyonder transports the lab to the patchwork planet known as Battleworld.
Battleworld serves as the backdrop of Marvel's crossover event, Secret Wars. And it's here that our symbiote encounters Spider-Man for the first time. The symbiote bonds with Spidey and initially serves as a new black suit for Spider-Man.
This is one of my favorite things ever. It is a massive upgrade from his original blue and red duds. It provides Spider-Man with organic webbing and even adds to his already superhuman endurance, agility, and strength, though Spidey doesn't realize that it's a living organism until after he returns to Earth.
Right, and as the symbiote continues to bond with Peter Parker, it feeds on his adrenaline. It even takes over Spidey's body while Peter sleeps, swinging around New York City in order to feed. So these nighttime adventures leave Peter exhausted, and it isn't until Peter seeks the scientific advice of Mr. Fantastic that he learns that what he thought was just a suit is fully alive.
And not just fully alive, but also trying to permanently bond with him, so much so that it proves difficult to separate the symbiote from Peter's body. Mr. Fantastic does learn its weaknesses though, loud sounds and fire, just like us. And ultimately, he uses a sonic blaster to remove the symbiote from Peter and imprison the creature for future studies.
Except those future studies never happen, because the symbiote manages to escape, find, and reattach itself to Peter. Peter fights its influence long enough to reach the bell tower of Our Lady of Saints Church, where, a certain individual is currently asking for forgiveness for the sin he's about to commit.
Now, while Spider-Man subjects himself to brain-shattering bell clangs in the bell tower, the symbiote is forced to flee. The symbiote then finds Eddie Brock inside the church after being drawn to Eddie's anger and despair.
Now, both Eddie and the symbiote share a hatred for Spider-Man. Eddie blames Spider-Man for ruining his career, while the symbiote hates him for discarding them. So when they bond together, they become Venom and go after Spidey for revenge.
While the Venom symbiote was attached to Spider-Man, though, it gained access to and copied Peter Parker's genetic code. As a result, the symbiote grants Eddie similar abilities, wall crawling and webbing, as well as some new tricks like shape-shifting and near invisibility.
And for a time, Venom uses those abilities to wreak havoc on Spider-Man's life. That is until a fight against Spidey that results in Eddie being locked up in prison and the symbiote seemingly destroyed. Of course, the symbiote does manage to survive and even tracks down Eddie in prison and frees him.
But not before giving birth to another symbiote that would later bond with the serial killer known as Cletus Cassidy and become Carnage.
Right, and it's the creation of Carnage that forces both Spider-Man and Venom to form a temporary truce in order to defeat what they deemed a bigger threat.
Now, after getting a taste of being a hero, Venom decides to leave New York for sunny San Francisco, where he becomes the city's lethal protector. There, he fought against the Life Foundation, a scientific organization that was fascinated by the symbiote's ability to reproduce.
In fact, when they did manage to temporarily capture Venom, they extracted 5 seeds from the symbiote that eventually became new symbiotic villains known as Agony, Lasher, Phage, Riot, and Scream.
And Sade, be sure to tag yourselves which one you are. I'm personally more of a Scream myself.
I see myself as more of a Riot girly.
Ooh. And Venom has had his own Eras tour, dancing the line between villain and anti-hero. He's been a member of villain super teams like the Sinister Six and heroic teams like the Savage Avengers. He's even led a multiversal team made up of other Venom variants.
I mean, how many people can say they've both nearly ended the world and saved it? That is some serious range.
Truly. And while Eddie Brock has taken on other symbiotic identities like Anti-Venom, the King in Black, and Toxin, the symbiote has also bonded with other hosts like the Spider-Man villain known as Scorpion, Mac Gargan, Peter Parker's high school bully, Flash Thompson, Eddie's ex-wife, Anne Wang, and even Eddie's son, Dylan Brock.
Though it's clear that despite their differences, Eddie and the Venom symbiote always manage to find their way back to each other.
Sounds like they might suffer from some separation anxiety. Video game reference.
In Venom War Number 1 from 2024, written by Al Ewing, we see that the most recent hosts of the Venom symbiote, Eddie Brock and his son Dylan, are preparing to face off. And while the line is clearly drawn between these two, there is one other major player in this fight that hasn't quite entered the fray just yet: the Venom symbiote itself. As the symbiote reflects on its past, it observes that it has acted more like a parasite than a symbiote. It's brought nothing but pain, suffering, and destruction to its hosts. While Eddie and Dylan head towards war, the symbiote realizes it's been in a constant state of conflict, fighting the fight of its hosts. And so, the symbiote retreats to a place where it can feel safe, wanted, and useful: Peter Parker's closet. When Peter Parker learns of the events of Venom War, he reaches into his closet to pull out a fresh costume. A fresh costume that, coincidentally, turns out to be the symbiote. As he quickly realizes this, Peter asks why it isn't with Eddie or Dylan, to which the symbiote answers that they're better off without it. Peter disagrees, giving the symbiote the following pep talk. "You're not some mindless monster. You're not so alien you don't know what good is. If you ever were, you've learned. So now you're stuck with the choice. Do good things, do bad things. Even doing nothing is a choice. And it sucks. Obviously, nobody asked for this, but the price of living is choosing how to live. Every day. Every moment we're alive. That's the only power any of us have. And power comes with responsibility. My uncle taught me that. And we can't turn away from it. We can't turn away from the choices we've made." Next week on the official Marvel podcast, we continue bringing you the answers to your questions as we're joined by Agatha All Along head writer and executive producer Jack Schaefer.
In the comics, the Salem 7 are so totally different, which I have some trepidation about that because they're very cool in the comics.
That's it for this week, though. This episode of the official Marvel podcast was hosted by Sade Spence and myself, Langston Belton.
Our producer is Jasmine Estrada.
With help from Senior Manager of Audio Production and Development, Brad Barton, and Production Manager, Emily Godfrey.
Mixed by Rye Dorsey.
Theme music by Ida Akbal.
Executive producers are Larissa Rosen and Jesse Berger.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.